It was a typical afternoon at one of the most luxurious restaurants in the city. The air was filled with the chatter of patrons and the clinking of fine china. Waiters moved swiftly between tables, their white shirts gleaming under the soft lights. At the back of the restaurant, a young black waitress moved between the tables with practiced ease, her movements calm and measured, a slight smile never leaving her face. She was used to the work. She was a professional. Today, however, something felt different. The billionaire was sitting at a corner table. His name was known in high society, his influence stretching across industries and nations. His tall frame was draped in a bespoke suit, the kind of clothing that suggested wealth without needing to scream it. He was a man who could buy anything except for genuine respect, perhaps. The smile on his face was that of someone used to being admired, used to commanding attention. And today, his eyes were locked on the waitress as she approached his table. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly as she arrived at his side. "Would you like more water?" The billionaire looked her over quickly. She was young, poised, and yet to him, she was just another face, another person in the service industry, a world far beneath him. He couldn't help himself. He wanted to test her, to see if she would be another one of those who would cower in front of his wealth. "Tell me," he asked, his voice carrying the air of someone who expected to be entertained. "Do you speak any other languages besides English?" It wasn't a casual question. He had asked it with an underlying tone, almost mocking, a challenge. The waitress blinked for a moment, surprised, but not intimidated. She had heard comments like this before. People often underestimated her because of her job and her appearance. But she wasn't here to prove herself to anyone. She was here to work. "Actually, yes," she replied with a calm smile. "I speak German fluently." The billionaire was taken aback. It was almost as if the words had caught him off guard, like a sharp turn in the conversation he wasn't expecting. He raised an eyebrow and leaned back in his chair, unsure of how to respond. "You speak German?" he asked incredulously, as if he hadn't heard her correctly. "Yes, I do," she confirmed, her voice steady. "Is there anything else you'd like to know, sir?" For a moment, the billionaire just sat there, stunned. His mind raced and he realized what had just happened. He had assumed she was just another waitress, someone who would play her part in the background. He had made the mistake of reducing her to a stereotype, but here she was, defying his expectations without even trying. She wasn't showing off. She wasn't being aggressive. She was simply answering his question. Calmly, confidently, and with impeccable fluency in a language he hadn't expected her to speak. The billionaire's face flushed slightly as he tried to regain his composure. He had been mocking her, testing her, and now it was as if the tables had turned. The dynamic had shifted in a matter of seconds, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something unfamiliar, a sense of vulnerability. He tried to brush it off with a forced laugh. "Well, that's impressive," he said, though his tone was now much less confident than before. The waitress smiled, but there was no malice in her expression. She had nothing to prove. "Thank you, sir. Would you like anything else?" she asked politely, her professionalism back in full force. He blinked a few times, still processing the shift in the situation. She hadn't just answered a question. She had done something far more significant. She had made him realize that there was much more to a person than the assumptions he made based on their job, their race, or their appearance. For a brief moment, the billionaire felt himself slipping from his position of power. He had assumed he was in control, he had money, status, and influence. But here, in front of him, was someone who had just stripped away the layers of his arrogance with a simple, polite response. The waitress, without even trying, had shattered his illusions of superiority. As she turned to walk away, he sat back in his chair, unsure of what to make of it. He had come to the restaurant expecting an uneventful meal, but now, he was facing something far more complex, something he wasn't prepared for. The billionaire sat in silence, his fingers drumming lightly on the edge of his glass. The restaurant's ambience, once comforting and familiar, now felt oppressive. The soft hum of conversations, the clinking of silverware, all seemed distant. His mind, however, was sharp, racing with thoughts that were difficult to process. What had just happened? He had never been caught off guard like that. People, especially in his circles, didn't challenge him, not in the way she had. He had expected her to be flustered, maybe even apologetic, when he made his little joke about her knowledge of languages. After all, wasn't that how it always went? He was rich, influential, he was the one who set the tone. But today was different. He took another sip of his wine, trying to calm his nerves. There was something about her response that had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. It wasn't just the fact that she spoke German, it was the way she carried herself. It was the confidence she exuded, the complete lack of hesitation in her answer. She hadn't been intimidated by his wealth, his status, or his condescending tone. Instead, she had treated him like any other person, and in doing so, she had taken the power away from him. For the first time in a long time, the billionaire felt the weight of his own assumptions. He had thought that money, status, and control were the keys to power. He had thought that, by keeping people in their places, he could maintain his dominance. But now, here was a woman who had simply taken the power back, without even trying. And that, in itself, was disorienting. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had made his living off of assumptions about people, about the world, about what made someone worthy of respect. But today, she had forced him to confront something deeper. It wasn't the wealth that defined him, it wasn't the deals he made or the company he kept. It was his ability to see people for who they truly were. That thought struck him like a bolt of lightning. The irony was hard to ignore. Here he was, a man who had built his empire on seeing opportunities where others saw only obstacles, and yet, he had completely missed the mark when it came to understanding the very people around him. The waitress, without saying a word, had shown him just how narrow his view had become. His fingers still drummed on the glass, but now, the rhythmic tapping felt hollow. He didn't know how to proceed. Part of him wanted to dismiss the entire interaction, to brush it off as a mere blip in his otherwise perfect day. But another part of him, the part he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge, knew that he couldn't. Not this time. The dinner continued, but the billionaire's mind was far from the meal in front of him. He was lost in thought, pondering the interaction. He wasn't sure if he felt embarrassed, enlightened, or both. What bothered him most was the nagging question that lingered in his mind. What had she seen that he hadn't? She hadn't been dismissive or sarcastic. She hadn't even raised her voice. She had simply answered his question, and in doing so, she had flipped the entire power dynamic. It was almost as if she had known all along that she was not to be underestimated. But how? How had she maintained such composure when most people would have shrunk in the face of his subtle mockery? The billionaire sat up straighter in his chair, eyes narrowing as he recalled the exchange. He could still hear her calm voice in his head, her words flowing effortlessly in perfect German. And despite all his wealth, despite all his years of experience navigating power dynamics, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed something he was incapable of doing himself. Something raw, real, and undeniably powerful. He had always prided himself on being in control. He was the one who made the rules, who decided what was valuable, what was worth pursuing. But here, in this restaurant, at this very moment, the balance of power had shifted in a way he hadn't expected, and he wasn't sure how to reclaim it. The night had grown late, and the restaurant was beginning to quiet down. The last few patrons lingered over their drinks, enjoying the slow pace of the evening. But for the billionaire, the night had become a reflection of something much deeper, something that gnawed at the edges of his consciousness. He had always believed that power came from wealth and influence, from the ability to control the lives of others, to shape the world around him to his will. It was the cornerstone of his empire. But what he had learned that evening was that true power was not something that could be bought or commanded. It was something that had to be earned, and it came from a place of inner strength. The waitress, without even realizing it, had taught him that lesson. She had done it with nothing more than a few words and a calm demeanor. In the face of his condescension, she had chosen to respond with poise, confidence, and a quiet authority that made him rethink everything he thought he knew about power. It wasn't just about speaking another language or knowing more than he expected. It was about her ability to maintain her dignity, to stand firm in her own self-worth, and to refuse to be cowed by someone like him. She had shown him that the truest form of power wasn't the ability to control others, but the ability to control yourself, to rise above the expectations others placed on you, and to assert your own value without apology. The billionaire found himself revisiting the moments of his life that had shaped him. He remembered the early days of his career, when he had been hungry for success, when he had been driven by the need to prove himself. He had clawed his way to the top, making deals, cutting people off, and doing whatever it took to win. But somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of something important. He had stopped seeing people for who they really were. He had started viewing them as tools, as means to an end. And in doing so, he had lost the very thing that had made him successful in the first place: the ability to connect with people, to respect them, to recognize their worth. The waitress had reminded him of that. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of something different, a kind of respect not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been dismissed or overlooked. The billionaire's thoughts swirled like a storm as he made his way out of the restaurant, his mind still tethered to the interaction. He stepped into the cold evening air, the chill brushing against his face, but it did little to cool the fire inside him. For the first time in a long time, he felt unsettled, vulnerable, even. His car waited at the curb, the driver standing by, but the billionaire couldn't bring himself to get in just yet. He stood there for a moment, staring at the streetlights and the shadows they cast on the pavement. The city seemed to be alive in a way he hadn't noticed before. Each corner, each alley, each passing face telling a story that was beyond his understanding. As the noise of the city faded into the background, the image of the waitress appeared in his mind once again. Her calm, steady presence was burned into his memory. She hadn't been a hero or a villain. She had simply been herself. She had done nothing extraordinary. She had only spoken the truth with quiet confidence, and that, more than anything, had shaken him to his core. He had expected her to be insignificant, a background figure in his grand, well-ordered world. But she wasn't. She had forced him to see the world from a different perspective, one where people weren't defined by their jobs, their status, or their wealth. They were defined by who they were inside, their strength, their self-worth, and their ability to remain true to themselves in the face of everything that tried to diminish them. The billionaire thought back to the way she had looked at him when she spoke. There had been no fear in her eyes, no hesitation, just calm, confident composure. She hadn't been intimidated by him, and that was the most powerful thing she could have done. It wasn't about speaking German. It wasn't even about the words she had said. It was about how she had carried herself, how she had refused to let his assumptions define her. He had spent his entire life building a facade of control. He had created an empire based on the idea that power was something you could wield like a weapon. But she had shown him that power wasn't about dominance. It wasn't about making others bend to your will. It was about finding your own voice, standing in your own truth, and refusing to be silenced. The billionaire closed his eyes for a moment, letting the wind wash over him. He had always thought that the more you had, the more power you commanded. But now he wasn't so sure. Maybe true power was something far simpler, something far more elusive than he had ever realized. The next few days passed in a blur. The billionaire went through his meetings, his calls, his usual routine, but something had shifted. The certainty he had always carried with him, the unshakable belief that he was in control, had started to crumble. The more he thought about the waitress, the more he realized how much of his life had been spent in pursuit of a power that wasn't real. Not the kind of power that could be felt in your bones, not the kind that could make you truly feel alive. It wasn't about the deals. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the influence or the status. Those things were fleeting. They could be gained and they could be lost. But the kind of power the waitress had shown him, quiet, unassuming, grounded in self-respect, was eternal. She hadn't needed anything to prove her worth. She was simply herself, and in doing so, she had exposed a truth that had eluded him for so long. It was humbling. The billionaire had spent years in the business world, surrounded by people who wore their success like armor, people who hid behind their wealth and their connections. They spoke of power as if it were something that could be measured, something that could be quantified in numbers and deals. But none of them, not a single one, had ever shown him the kind of quiet strength the waitress had demonstrated. Her power didn't come from anything external. It wasn't something she could buy. It wasn't something that could be handed to her. It was something she had cultivated within herself, something that radiated outward in the most unassuming way possible. She had shown him that true strength wasn't about controlling others. It was about controlling yourself, about being the person you were meant to be without needing to seek validation. The billionaire felt the weight of that realization like a ton of bricks. It wasn't a lesson he had expected to learn, and certainly not from someone like her. But now that it had been revealed to him, he couldn't ignore it. He couldn't go back to the way he had been. His eyes had been opened, and they could not be closed again. He had always prided himself on being able to read people, on understanding what made them tick, what drove them. But this was different. This wasn't a game of strategy or manipulation. This was something deeper, something more real. The billionaire began to wonder how many other people he had underestimated, how many others had hidden their true power behind a mask, and how many had simply been waiting for someone to see them, to recognize the strength they carried without needing to shout about it. The next time the billionaire walked into a room, the world felt different. The bustling of the city seemed more vibrant, more complex. He could no longer view it as he once had, through a lens of dominance and control. The lessons learned in the quiet corner of the restaurant echoed in his mind. Every person he encountered now seemed to carry a potential he had failed to see before. It was in the way they spoke, the way they carried themselves, the way they treated one another. The quiet strength, the resilience that he had witnessed in the waitress, seemed to exist in everyone. Hidden, sometimes buried under the weight of expectations or insecurities, but they're all the same. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized how often he had overlooked this power in others. He had been too focused on what they didn't have, their outward circumstances, their positions, to ever see what they truly offered. In his meetings, he started paying attention to the way people communicated, not just with their words, but with their actions. He began noticing the subtle ways they expressed their value, their contributions, not by boasting, but through quiet acts of confidence and understanding. There was something profoundly powerful in these moments, something that wasn't bound by wealth or status, but by the truth of who they were. It wasn't long before the billionaire found himself questioning the very foundation of his empire. His success had been built on the notion that wealth and control were the ultimate measures of power. He had prided himself on the fact that he could manipulate circumstances, shape outcomes to suit his needs. But now, with this new understanding, he saw how hollow that approach had been. Success wasn't about bending others to your will. It was about creating an environment where people could thrive, where their true power could emerge. He began to look inward, to question his own motivations. Why had he sought so much power in the first place? What had driven him to accumulate wealth, to surround himself with people who admired him, feared him? Had it been for validation, for respect, or had it simply been a way to mask the insecurity he had never truly addressed? For the first time, he acknowledged the fear that had always haunted him, the fear of being seen as weak, as inconsequential. And in that acknowledgement, something shifted. It was as though the weight he had carried for so long began to lift, allowing him to breathe a little easier. He didn't need to be the most powerful man in the room anymore. He didn't need to prove his worth to anyone. What mattered now was not the image he projected, but the person he had become in the quiet moments, in the moments of vulnerability and self-reflection. The waitress had shown him that power wasn't about dominance. It was about self-mastery. It was about embracing your own worth, your own voice, without needing anyone else to validate it. A week had passed since the fateful dinner, but the billionaire's thoughts continued to return to that moment. It was as if he had been standing at the edge of a cliff, looking into a vast expanse he had never noticed before. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. But now he had a new mission. He wanted to change, not just for himself but for everyone around him. He wanted to create something that wasn't built on manipulation or power plays. He wanted to build something that allowed people to find their own voice, to embrace their own strength, just as the waitress had done without hesitation. As he walked into his office the next day, he found himself looking at the people around him differently. The assistants, the junior executives, even the cleaners, everyone had a role to play, but more importantly, everyone had value. He had spent years viewing his employees as tools to further his own goals. But now, he saw them as individuals, each with their own potential, their own story, their own quiet power. He called his board of directors together, a meeting he had been planning for weeks. They arrived, as always, in their tailored suits, their faces set in the professional expressions that masked their true selves. He had always been the one to set the tone in these meetings, the one to decide the direction, to take charge. But today, something would be different. As they gathered around the table, he looked at them, each one of them, and realized something. He wasn't the only one with ideas. He wasn't the only one with answers. They all had something to contribute, something valuable. And so, he began the meeting not with his usual assertiveness, but with a question. What do you think? What are your ideas? The room was silent for a moment. It was rare for him to open the floor to his team so completely. They had been conditioned to wait for his directives, to respond to his lead. But now they were given permission to speak freely. Slowly, one by one, his team members began to share their thoughts. It wasn't immediate, but over the course of the meeting, the ideas flowed, and the room buzzed with new energy. For the first time, the billionaire saw his company as more than just a mechanism for making money. He saw it as a collective, a place where everyone's voice mattered, where everyone's contributions were valued. The change was subtle at first. It wasn't some grand transformation. It was the little things, the way people spoke up in meetings, the way they started offering ideas without waiting for permission. It was the way they began to feel more comfortable in their own skin, more confident in their own abilities. And it was the way he felt too. He felt lighter, freer, more connected to the people around him. The power he had once sought to control now seemed irrelevant. What mattered now was the growth, the collaboration, the shared vision that they were all creating together. The billionaire's life, his business, his perspective on the world had changed irrevocably. The waitress, with her quiet confidence and simple answer, had altered the course of his future without even knowing it. He realized that true influence didn't come from control or fear, but from respect for oneself and for others. As time went on, the lessons of that evening echoed through every part of his life. The way he walked into a room, the way he spoke to people, the way he interacted with his team, all of it had transformed. And it wasn't just about putting on a new face or adopting a new strategy. No, it was about a fundamental shift in the way he viewed himself and the people around him. For years, he had operated under the assumption that he was the center of it all, that his worth was defined by the deals he closed, the people he commanded, and the wealth he accumulated. But now he saw himself as a part of something larger. A network of individuals who all had their own stories, their own strengths, their own voices to share. His company, once a well-oiled machine built on his direction alone, began to function as a true collective. His employees, the very people he had once viewed as instruments in his quest for success, started to show a different side of themselves, an authentic, empowered side. They were no longer afraid to speak up, no longer hesitant to bring their ideas to the table. The shift was palpable. In meetings, they spoke freely, exchanged thoughts with genuine curiosity, and the conversations began to flow in new directions. The energy in the room was different. It wasn't one-sided anymore. It was collaborative, dynamic, and alive with possibility. For the first time in his career, the billionaire felt like he wasn't carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He no longer needed to make every decision himself or control every aspect of the business. He trusted his team. He valued their input, and he realized that he was not the only one capable of making the important choices. This new approach, this embrace of vulnerability, didn't make him weaker. It made him stronger. The more he let go of his need to dominate, the more powerful he became, not in the way he had once imagined, but in a way that allowed him to become a better leader, a better colleague, and, ultimately, a better person. The ripple effect spread beyond the office walls. He noticed the change in the way he interacted with people outside of work. Clients, friends, even strangers. He had always been the type of person to close deals with a firm handshake and a confident smile. But now, his approach was different. He was no longer interested in impressing others with his power or wealth. Instead, he found himself more focused on understanding people, on listening, truly listening to what they had to say. And in turn, people began to open up to him in ways they never had before. His relationships became more genuine, and the connections he forged were built on trust and mutual respect, rather than manipulation or mutual benefit. Even in the most challenging situations, the billionaire found himself handling conflict in a more balanced way. When problems arose, whether they were financial setbacks, misunderstandings with partners, or internal struggles within the company, he no longer reacted out of fear or ego. Instead, he took a step back, examined the situation from all angles, and addressed the issue with a level-headedness that was new to him. He didn't need to win every battle anymore. What mattered was finding solutions that were fair, that took into account the needs and concerns of everyone involved. His perspective on leadership evolved in ways he hadn't expected. He came to realize that leadership wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room or demanding respect from others. It was about earning respect by demonstrating kindness, humility, and empathy. He wasn't afraid to admit when he didn't know something or when he had made a mistake. And when he didn't hide behind excuses or blame. He took responsibility, knowing that true leaders set the example not just in their success, but in how they handled failure and setbacks. As the months passed, his company's growth became a reflection of this transformation. Profits continued to rise, but it wasn't just the financial success that he cared about anymore. It was the way people felt working for him, the sense of fulfillment and pride they took in their work. The employees felt valued, not just for their output but for who they were as individuals. It was no longer about hitting numbers or hitting targets. It was about creating an environment where everyone could thrive, where every voice had a place at the table, and where each person's unique strengths could contribute to something greater than themselves. One of the most profound changes was in his relationship with his family. For years, he had been absent, too focused on his business, too consumed by his ambition to give his loved ones the attention they deserved. But as he changed, so did his relationships. He became more present, more engaged, and more supportive. He learned to listen not just to his colleagues, but to the people who mattered most in his life. And in doing so, he began to repair the bonds that had once been strained. He realized that the true measure of success wasn't in the wealth you accumulated or the power you wielded. It was in the people you loved and the connections you fostered along the way. And through all of this, he never forgot the waitress. She was, in many ways, the catalyst for this change. He thought about her often, not just because of how she had stunned him that night, but because of the strength she had shown without even trying. She had reminded him of the simplicity of true power. It wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It didn't require validation. It was quiet, humble, and rooted in self-worth. And he had found a way to carry that lesson with him every day. He knew that, in the end, it wasn't the wealth or the status that defined him. It was the way he treated people, the way he listened, the way he led. And in that, he had found something more valuable than all the riches in the world. A sense of peace, a sense of purpose, and the knowledge that he could be part of something greater than himself. It had been nearly a year since that dinner, that moment when everything had changed. The billionaire had traveled far since then, not in miles but in personal growth. Looking out from his office window at the city he had once viewed as nothing more than a playground for his ambitions, he now saw it through different eyes. The towering buildings, the crowded streets, the flashing billboards. They no longer symbolized success for him. They were just backdrops to the real work, the work of understanding people, connecting with them, and empowering them to succeed on their own terms. The transformation had not been easy, but it had been necessary. His empire was still intact, still growing, but the way it grew had shifted. No longer was it about him at the center of it all, making decisions from a place of control. No, now it was about the team he had surrounded himself with, the people who believed in the vision, and the mutual respect they all shared. That was what made the company thrive, not the constant pressure to be the biggest, the best, or the loudest. Every day had been a lesson. Sometimes those lessons were small, like the way his employees began speaking up in meetings, sharing ideas without hesitation. Sometimes they were larger, like the way his relationships with his partners and clients had evolved. He no longer relied on manipulation or subtle power plays. He was learning to lead through trust, not fear. But it wasn't just his business that had changed. It was his life, his entire worldview. He had started to see that power, real power, wasn't about accumulating wealth or dominating people. It was about making people feel seen, making them feel heard, and providing the platform for them to rise. He didn't need to be at the top anymore. What mattered was that everyone in his company had a chance to grow, to succeed. And for the first time in his life, he truly understood what it meant to be a leader. Not just a boss, but someone who uplifted others. There were times, of course, when the old temptations resurfaced. The desire to control, to exert influence over every detail, was never truly gone. But those moments became fewer and farther between. Each time, he reminded himself of the lessons he had learned. Every time he felt the old urge to dominate, he took a step back. He asked himself, what would be best for the team, for the person on the other side of this decision? And each time, the answers were simpler, kinder, more empathetic. It wasn't about him anymore, it was about them. About the people he worked with, the people he interacted with daily. And slowly, the weight that he had carried for so long, the weight of ego, of always needing to be right, began to lift. The phone rang, breaking his thoughts. It was a call he had been waiting for. One of the major clients who had been with him from the early days was on the line, ready to discuss a new, exciting venture. It was the kind of deal that would bring in millions, possibly billions, but this time the approach was different. Mr. Howard, his assistant said, they're ready for the call. He took a deep breath before picking up the phone. This call wasn't about asserting dominance or making sure he came out on top. It wasn't about proving his worth or getting the upper hand. This call, just like every other interaction he now had, was about partnership. About collaboration. Hello, Mr. Howard, he said, his voice calm and steady. I'm looking forward to discussing this opportunity with you. As the conversation continued, he realized just how far he had come. The old version of himself would have been racing ahead, trying to force the conversation into his desired outcome. But now he was listening. He was asking questions, allowing his client to speak, genuinely interested in their thoughts. It wasn't about the immediate payoff, it was about building a long-term, authentic relationship. And it felt right. When the call ended, he sat back in his chair, a satisfied smile on his face. He had not only secured a significant deal, but he had done it in a way that felt natural. He had let go of the pressure to perform and had embraced the idea that success didn't have to come at the expense of authenticity. The rest of the day flowed in much the same way. He met with his team, listened to their ideas, and offered guidance not from a place of superiority but from a place of shared experience. He realized that leadership wasn't just about giving direction, it was about empowering others to find their own path and giving them the tools to walk it. As the sun set over the horizon, casting a warm glow across his office, the billionaire reflected on how much had changed. He had no illusions about being perfect. He still made mistakes, still had moments of doubt, and he knew there would always be challenges ahead. But now he felt equipped to face them. He wasn't alone. He had a team, a family, and a vision that extended far beyond his own success. And it all started with a simple encounter. A moment when a waitress had unknowingly shattered the illusion of control he had so desperately clung to. She had given him a glimpse into a world where power wasn't something to be taken, but something to be shared. And from that moment on, everything changed. Months passed, and as the billionaire's company grew, so did his influence. Not in the way he had once imagined, but in the way he now understood, through kindness, respect, and collaboration. He started giving back in ways he never had before. He funded initiatives for education, particularly for underprivileged children who, like the waitress, had been overlooked or underestimated. He supported mental health awareness programs, recognizing that true strength came not from external appearances but from within. He set up scholarships and mentorship programs, determined to give young people the tools they needed to succeed, just as he had been given opportunities. One of the most profound decisions he made was to create a foundation in his own name, not for vanity, but as a tool for long-term generational change. He used his platform to advocate for ethical business practices, sustainability, and social justice. The more he engaged with these causes, the more he realized how much greater the impact could be when people worked together for something bigger than themselves. Through this work, he formed lasting relationships with activists, philanthropists, and leaders who shared his vision. He found himself in rooms filled not with people who wanted to take, but with those who wanted to give, to change, and to uplift. It was no longer about building an empire for himself. It was about building a legacy that would last long after he was gone. The billionaire didn't know where the journey would take him next, but he felt ready. For the first time in his life, he was no longer chasing after something he didn't need. He had found his purpose, and it wasn't about wealth or power. It was about connection, empowerment, and giving back. He leaned back in his chair, looking out at the city he had once viewed as a collection of opportunities. Now he saw it as a canvas, a place where the stories of countless people were waiting to be written. And he was ready to be part of that story, not as the one who dictated its course, but as the one who listened, learned, and grew alongside those he helped along the way. As he reflected on everything that had happened, he realized something profound. It wasn't the billionaire who had changed the world. It was the world that had changed him. A year had passed since the billionaire's shift in perspective, and with each day, the changes within him grew more profound. He had once believed that vulnerability was a weakness, something to be hidden at all costs. In his early years, he had built a persona of invulnerability, a shield to protect himself from the insecurities and doubts that threatened to undermine his confidence. But now, vulnerability had become one of his greatest strengths. It wasn't that he had discarded his ambition or drive. He was still a man of vision and determination. But now, those qualities were tempered by a deep sense of humility and a willingness to admit when he didn't have all the answers. The power of vulnerability, he realized, was in its ability to connect people, to foster trust, and to open the door for genuine growth, both personally and professionally. His relationships had flourished as a result. In his early years, he had kept people at arm's length, maintaining an emotional distance that allowed him to control every interaction. But now, he found himself allowing others into his world, into the complexities of his thoughts and feelings. He was no longer afraid to ask for help, to acknowledge his mistakes, or to lean on others when he needed support. At work, this shift was even more apparent. He began holding regular meetings with his leadership team, not as a directive from the top down, but as an open conversation. He asked them for their opinions, their concerns, and their ideas. He didn't have all the answers, and he wasn't afraid to admit it. It was a change that transformed the dynamic of the entire organization. His employees, who had once viewed him as a distant figure of authority, now saw him as a leader who truly cared about their opinions and their well-being. But vulnerability wasn't always easy. There were times when it felt uncomfortable, when he second-guessed his decision to be open with others. It was hard for someone who had spent most of his life hiding behind a mask of perfection. But the more he practiced vulnerability, the more natural it became. He learned to embrace the discomfort, to sit with it, and to allow himself the space to be imperfect. It wasn't just his team that benefited from this shift in perspective. As he became more open with his family and friends, his relationships with them deepened. He found himself reconnecting with old friends he had neglected during his years of focus on work. He was more present with his children, more engaged in their lives, listening to their dreams and concerns without feeling the need to offer solutions or advice. He realized that sometimes, just being there for someone without judgment or expectation was the most powerful thing he could offer. Vulnerability, he realized, wasn't about weakness. It was about courage, the courage to be seen for who you truly were, flaws and all. And in that process, he had found strength in his authenticity. As the billionaire reflected on his journey, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for the lessons he had learned. Vulnerability had opened doors to deeper connections, richer relationships, and a more fulfilling life. It had also made him a better leader, more capable of inspiring trust and loyalty in those around him. He knew that this was just the beginning. The more he embraced his vulnerability, the more he would be able to grow both as a person and as a leader. The billionaire had learned that leadership wasn't just about making decisions. It was about creating an environment where everyone had the chance to grow. The more he embraced his vulnerability and authenticity, the more he saw the ripple effect it had on those around him. His employees, his family, and his partners had all been impacted by the change in him. But what amazed him most was how these shifts extended beyond his immediate circle, touching the lives of countless others in ways he couldn't have predicted. He began to notice how his openness had inspired others to embrace their own vulnerability. Employees, once hesitant to speak up, now shared their thoughts and ideas without fear of judgment. They felt safe to take risks, to fail, and to learn from their mistakes. They no longer saw their work as something they had to do for him. They saw it as something they were doing together as a team. The company's culture had become one of collaboration, trust, and mutual respect. It wasn't just within the walls of his company that he saw change. The billionaire had made a conscious decision to engage with the broader community, to share his journey of growth and transformation with others. He began speaking at conferences and events, sharing his story of how vulnerability had changed his life. He talked about how he had once been driven by the need to control, to dominate, and how he had learned that true power came from within. His story resonated with people, and soon he was receiving messages from individuals all over the world. Messages of gratitude, of inspiration, and of hope. But the ripple effect didn't stop there. The billionaire realized that by embracing vulnerability, he had created a space for others to do the same. His employees were more willing to take risks, to push boundaries, and to innovate. His family members were more open with each other, sharing their struggles and supporting one another in ways they never had before. His partners and clients, too, began to view him in a new light. They saw him as someone they could trust, someone who understood the importance of collaboration and authenticity. As the years passed, the impact of his transformation continued to grow. His company became a model for others, a shining example of how a culture of vulnerability, trust, and respect could lead to lasting success. The billionaire's story was shared in business schools, leadership workshops, and community groups, inspiring a new generation of leaders to embrace vulnerability as a core value. The ripple effect had become a wave, one that spread far beyond what he had ever imagined. And as he looked back on the path he had traveled, he realized that the true measure of his success wasn't the empire he had built, but the lives he had touched along the way. His legacy wasn't defined by his wealth or his achievements. It was defined by the people he had empowered, the relationships he had nurtured, and the world he had helped to create. As the billionaire sat at his desk, reviewing the latest progress reports and market analyses, he was struck by how far he had come. The numbers on the page no longer held the same meaning for him. It wasn't about the profits, the growth, or the market share. Those things were important, of course, but they were no longer the measure of success. The true measure, he had learned, was the impact he had on the people around him, the legacy he was building through the way he led and the way he treated others. He thought back to the early days, when his goal had been to create an empire, to be recognized as the most successful businessman in the world. He had built his empire on the backs of others, pushing them to their limits, demanding perfection, and seeking to control every aspect of his business. But now, his focus had shifted. The empire he had built was still there, but it was now one that thrived on collaboration, mutual respect, and trust. His leadership had become about more than just guiding his company to success. It had become about leaving a lasting legacy, a legacy of integrity, empathy, and vulnerability. It was about inspiring others to lead with authenticity, to prioritize people over profits, and to create a culture where everyone had the opportunity to thrive. The billionaire knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would still be challenges, obstacles, and moments of doubt. But he had come to understand that these challenges were part of the journey. They were opportunities to grow, to learn, and to continue evolving as a leader. And as he looked to the future, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. His company was in good hands, and his impact on the world would continue to grow long after he was gone. His legacy would live on in the work of those he had mentored, in the communities he had helped, and in the lives he had touched. For the first time in his life, he was content. He had found a purpose greater than himself, and in doing so, he had created a legacy that would endure for generations to come. As the billionaire looked out over the city, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. The world he had once tried to control had become a place of connection, collaboration, and shared success. The empire he had built was no longer just about wealth and power, it was about people. It was about building something that would outlast him, something that would make a positive impact on the world for years to come. He thought about the journey he had taken, the way he had started out as a man driven by ambition, success, and the need to prove himself. He had once believed that power came from domination, from controlling every detail and making others bend to his will. But now, he understood that true power came from within. It came from the ability to empower others, to listen, to learn, and to grow. He smiled to himself, thinking about the waitress who had unknowingly changed the course of his life. She had been the catalyst, the spark that had ignited the fire of transformation within him. He would never forget her, not just because of the words she had spoken, but because of the way she had shown him the true meaning of power, the true meaning of leadership. And as he looked out at the horizon, he knew that his journey was far from over. There was still work to be done, still lives to be touched, still lessons to be learned. But now, he was no longer chasing after success for its own sake. He was chasing after something greater, the opportunity to make a lasting difference in the world. For the first time in his life, he was truly free. Free to lead with authenticity. Free to build something meaningful. Free to create a legacy that would stand the test of time. The billionaire sat at his desk one last time, the familiar weight of leadership no longer a burden, but a privilege. The company he had once built to serve his own ambitions had transformed into something far greater than he ever could have imagined. It was no longer a machine driven by profits and market dominance, but a thriving ecosystem where people came first, where ideas were valued, and where true leadership meant empowering others to reach their fullest potential. His empire, once rooted in control and authority, had blossomed into a testament to what was possible when trust, vulnerability, and authenticity were at the core of an organization. Over the years, he had watched his team evolve. What had once been a group of individuals working under his guidance had become a collective of leaders in their own right. He had given them the space to grow, to take ownership, and to innovate. And now, as he prepared to step away from his role as CEO, he knew the company would continue to thrive without him. His legacy wasn't built on spreadsheets or quarterly results. It was built on the relationships he had fostered, the trust he had nurtured, and the culture he had created. He looked out the window, the cityscape stretching before him, and smiled. It was a bittersweet moment, this moment of reflection. There had been times when he had been unsure if he could make it this far, moments of doubt that had crept in. But he had persevered, not because he had all the answers, but because he had learned to embrace uncertainty, to face challenges with an open mind, and to trust the people around him to help find solutions. He had learned that leadership wasn't about having all the answers. It was about asking the right questions. It was about listening, learning, and growing together. It was about building a legacy that wasn't defined by what you achieved, but by the impact you had on others, by the way you helped them become the best versions of themselves. His thoughts drifted back to the beginning of his journey. He remembered the man he had once been, so driven, so focused on success, so afraid of showing vulnerability. That man had built an empire, but at the cost of his own happiness, his relationships, and his peace of mind. The journey had been long, but it had been worth every step. Because in the end, it wasn't the money, the recognition, or the power that mattered. It was the connections, the trust, and the lives he had touched along the way. The phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a call he had been waiting for, a call from his successor, someone he had carefully mentored over the years. She was ready to take the reins, and he knew she would lead with the same values he had instilled in the company. He had always known that true leadership meant preparing others to step into your shoes and carry the torch forward. This moment was the culmination of everything he had worked for, everything he had built. "Hello," he answered, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Mr. Howard," she said, her voice filled with enthusiasm. "I just wanted to thank you for everything you've done for me, and for the company. I'm ready to take this forward." He smiled. "You don't need to thank me. You've already proven yourself. This is your time. I have no doubt you'll take this company to even greater heights." She paused for a moment, "It's not just the company, Mr. Howard. It's the way you've taught us to lead, to trust each other, to listen, to be vulnerable. I can't wait to put all of that into practice." He felt a lump in his throat. This was it. The moment he had been working towards, the moment when he would pass the baton, knowing that everything he had built would continue to grow and flourish. He sat back in his chair, letting the weight of the moment sink in. He had achieved everything he had set out to accomplish, but it wasn't the way he had imagined it. It wasn't the money, the accolades, or the titles that defined his success. It was the people. It was the way he had helped others unlock their potential, the way he had created a culture of empathy and trust, the way he had led by example, showing others that leadership was about lifting people up, not keeping them down. And now, as he prepared to step into the next chapter of his life, he knew that his legacy wasn't just in the work he had done. It was in the lives he had touched. The ripple effect he had set in motion would continue long after he was gone. His story would live on in the people he had empowered, in the teams that would carry the company forward, and in the communities that had benefited from the changes he had helped create. The billionaire looked out at the city once more. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the skyline. He had spent so many years chasing success, trying to prove himself, trying to build something that would stand the test of time. But now, he realized that the greatest success wasn't in the empire he had built. It was in the way he had changed, the way he had helped others change, and the way he had made a lasting impact on the world around him. And as he stood up, ready to move on to the next chapter of his life, he felt a sense of peace that he had never known before. He had built a legacy that wasn't defined by wealth or power. It was defined by the people he had helped, the lives he had touched, and the lessons he had learned along the way. The story of his life, he realized, wasn't over. It was only just beginning.